3 weeks after her husband walked away with the house, the savings, and nearly every possession they had spent 34 years building together, Evelyn Brooks stood in front of a boarded-up restaurant with exactly $18,700 left to her name. Everyone who drove past the building saw an abandoned business that should have been torn down years ago. Evelyn saw something else. She saw a second chance.
What she didn't know was that before the month was over, she would uncover a secret hidden beneath those cracked wooden floors. A secret tied to a name she hadn't heard since childhood. A secret that would become the one thing her ex-husband could never take away.
Before we get into how she found it, if stories about second chances speak to you, hit subscribe now so you don't miss what's buried under that floor. At 61, Evelyn had become invisible. Not because people couldn't see her, because they had stopped looking. For more than 3 decades, she had been the quiet woman standing beside Richard Brooks, who owned one of the largest home renovation companies in Western Georgia. People admired his success. Clients praised his leadership. Business magazines featured his smiling face. Nobody knew Evelyn had answered customer calls before sunrise, balanced invoices after midnight, and spent years entertaining clients in the family home while making sure every deal ended with a signed contract. Her name wasn't printed on a single company document. "We're husband and wife," Richard used to say. "What's mine is yours." She believed him. For 34 years. Then one Monday afternoon, an envelope arrived. Divorce papers. By then, Richard had already been planning his exit for nearly 2 years. The company had been restructured, properties transferred, investments moved. Every signature Evelyn had trusted him enough to place on legal documents had slowly written her out of the life she thought they owned together. Richard kept the house, the company, the cabin, the accounts. Evelyn kept an aging pickup truck, 2 suitcases, a box of family photographs, and $18,700. Richard called it a generous settlement. She called it 34 years, disappearing in a single afternoon. For the first week, Evelyn barely left the small apartment above an old hardware store. She unpacked slowly. 1 coffee mug, 1 blanket, 2 framed photographs of her parents, and avoided mirrors, not from shame, but because every reflection reminded her she no longer knew who she was, without the life she'd spent decades building. One detail kept surfacing in her mind that week, half buried and strange. Her mother, near the end of her life, gripping Evelyn's hand and murmuring, "Harper's. Don't let them tear down Harper's." At the time, sedated and drifting, it had sounded like nonsense. Evelyn had never asked what it meant. There had never been a Harper in the family, and her mother rarely spoke of her life before marriage at all. She hadn't thought about those words in years, until a rainy Thursday morning, driving with no real destination, she passed a faded sign on the corner of Maple and Jefferson, "Harper's Family Kitchen." She pulled into the empty lot before she'd decided to. The real estate number was still taped inside the dusty front window. The owner, an elderly man named Walter Harper, answered on the second ring. "You interested in buying?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "I just can't stop looking at it." An hour later, Walter unlocked the front door. Dust floated through beams of afternoon light. Old booths sat exactly where customers had left them 9 years earlier. "You'll think I'm crazy," Walter said, "but I never had the heart to strip it." The asking price was $26,000. Evelyn had less than 19. Every dollar she owned represented survival. She should have walked away. "What if I offered $18,700? Walter studied her for a long moment. "Are you planning to reopen it?" "Yes." "Not flip it?" "No." "Not tear it down?" "Never." He extended his hand. "You've got yourself a restaurant." Then, before she could thank him, "I wasn't selling the building. I was choosing the next caretaker." 2 weeks later, the restaurant belonged to Evelyn Brooks. Her own son called. "Mom, you barely have enough to survive. What are you doing buying an abandoned diner?" "I'm buying something nobody can divorce me from," she said. Neither of them knew quite what to say after that. The work was exhausting. She scrubbed decades of grease from the kitchen walls, sorted broken dishes into piles, cleared the back pantry alone. On the fourth afternoon, dragging the last crate aside, the floor answered her differently than it had everywhere else. A hollow knock instead of solid concrete. One floorboard near the back wall didn't match the others. Newer nails, slightly darker wood. Someone had lifted it before, and carefully. Underneath, wrapped in canvas, was a rusted metal lockbox. Across the lid, in faded ink barely visible beneath the dust. For Margaret Collins, or any of her children. Margaret Collins, her mother's maiden name, the name almost no one, not even Richard, had ever known to ask about. Evelyn didn't open everything at once. She let herself sit with it first. The first bundle held old photographs. One stopped her cold. A young woman standing proudly beside the restaurant's original sign, unmistakably her mother, decades younger. On the back, Margaret's first day, summer of 1978. "My mother worked here," Evelyn whispered. She had never known. She couldn't bring herself to open the rest that day. It felt like too much to take in at once, like opening a second letter before she'd finished reading the first. The next morning, she came back to it. The second bundle was recipe cards in careful handwriting. Chicken and dumplings, sweet potato biscuits, blackberry cobbler, each signed Clara Harper, Walter's late wife. Small margin notes, needs another pinch of sage. Never change this recipe. The third bundle waited until that evening. Legal paperwork, folded inside an envelope marked Private Partnership Agreement, a profit-sharing document. 2 signatures at the bottom. Harold Harper, Margaret Collins, Margaret Collins. Her mother hadn't simply worked there. She had owned part of it. Walter's eyes widened when she showed him the photograph. "You found the box. You knew it was there?" "I knew someone hid it. I never knew exactly where." Over 2 hours at his kitchen table, he told her the rest. In 1978, the restaurant was nearly bankrupt. Margaret worked nights there after her shifts at the textile mill, and when the bank refused another loan, she quietly invested her savings to keep it open. She refused repayment, Walter said. Told Harold to use the money to keep people employed instead. She didn't want anyone feeling like they owed her. That's just who Margaret was. He handed her Clara's old leather journal. One entry from October 1978. "Margaret refused repayment again today, said the restaurant belongs to this town now." Another, further on. "If anything ever happens to us, don't lose Margaret's paperwork. She deserves more than anyone knows." Attorney Grace Holloway didn't confirm anything quickly.
It took her most of a week, pulling probate filings, tracing whether the ownership interest had ever been formally dissolved or absorbed into an estate, checking whether the statute of limitations on an unrecorded partnership even applied after this many decades.
"It's unusual," Grace admitted, "but it's clean. Your mother's interest was never bought out, never signed away, never touched. It just sat forgotten. Legally, when she passed, it transferred to her only surviving child. You." Evelyn didn't think about money on the drive home. She thought about a woman who worked double shifts, raised a family, and quietly helped save a struggling restaurant without ever mentioning it to anyone, including the daughter she whispered its name to only once, at the very end. Word spread through town fast. An elderly couple brought pie. A retired electrician rewired the kitchen for free. A teenager asked to volunteer after school. "I don't want it to disappear." Then a black SUV pulled into the lot. Nathan Pierce, of Heritage Southern Restaurants, laid out an offer. They'd fund the restoration. She'd stay majority owner. "There's one clause I want changed," Evelyn said, sliding the folder back across the counter. "Nothing about the recipes leaves this building. Not for a cookbook, not for a chain, not for anything with Heritage's name on it, bigger than a menu credit." Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "Fair." He struck the line himself. It wasn't a fight, but it was a beat. She wasn't handed the deal, she shaped it. Richard heard the news over lunch. The woman who bought Harper's apparently inherited part of the business. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. What woman? Evelyn Brooks. He was calling his attorney before the check came. "I want every document connected to that restaurant," Richard, the divorce is finalized. I don't care. If she's sitting on something valuable, I want my share. Richard thinks he can still take this from her too. If you think he's about to lose everything, drop a comment and stick around, because what happens in that courtroom is not what he expects. He filed the lawsuit anyway. Small towns talk fast, and soon people were stopping by the restaurant to ask Evelyn if it was true. She never criticized him. The court will decide, she'd say, and go back to wiping down a table. Behind the scenes, Richard's own attorney had reservations he didn't voice loudly enough. To argue the ownership belonged to the marriage, he needed Richard's financial records from that exact period. The same years Richard had spent quietly restructuring the company, moving properties, and having Evelyn sign documents she never fully understood. Pulling those records for the lawsuit meant putting them in front of a judge, and a judge's clerk, and, eventually, an accountant who had no reason to be looking for anything at all, until she was handed the file. Richard arrived polished and certain, the way he'd looked throughout their marriage whenever he believed he'd already won. Evelyn wore a plain navy dress and carried only a folder and her mother's photograph. Judge Elaine Foster reviewed the documents in silence, then looked up. "Counsel, can you explain how a partnership interest predating this marriage, inherited outside probate to a single beneficiary, became marital property? We believe the appreciation occurred during the marriage, and the ownership itself predates it. The inheritance? Protected." She closed the folder. "This court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claim. Case dismissed." Richard didn't move for a full second. Then he stood too fast, nearly knocking his chair back, and walked out without looking at her.
It should have ended there. It didn't.
The financial records Richard's own attorney had pulled for the case didn't just fail to help him. They raised questions no one had been looking for. Several contractor deposits didn't match reported income. Numbers that had been shuffled during the same restructuring that erased Evelyn from company paperwork now looked less like a divorce strategy and more like something state auditors would want explained. Within weeks, investigators requested more documents. Not because of Evelyn, because the same signatures he'd used to write her out of everything were the ones that didn't add up under a closer look. His largest client quietly ended their contract. Then another. Banks delayed financing. Employees started leaving before he could get ahead of the story. He hadn't lost it to Evelyn. He'd lost it to the paper trail he made, trying to erase her. Harper's Family Kitchen reopened on a Saturday. Cars lined both sides of Maple Street before sunrise. An elderly woman was first through the door, holding a faded photograph of her own. "My parents met here in 1982, she said. "I've been waiting years for this place to come home." By noon, every table was full. Every plate came with a small card.
Dedicated to Margaret Collins, who believed some places deserve a second chance. Most customers didn't know the whole story. They didn't need to. They could taste it in the biscuits Walter still swore needed 2 more minutes.
Months later, Richard drove past the restaurant on his way somewhere else. A smaller condo now, a smaller company sold off in pieces. The lot was full. Families were laughing through the windows. He slowed the car for a moment. Then he kept driving.
He had spent 34 years believing he knew exactly who Evelyn was. He was wrong. The greatest thing she ever inherited wasn't a restaurant. It was the quiet strength to begin again when everyone else thought her story was over.
If you liked this one, hit like and subscribe. It helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. If this story reminded you that the end of one chapter can become the beginning of something greater, tell us in the comments. If you were Evelyn, would you have forgiven Richard or moved on and never looked back? And if you love stories about resilience and ordinary people finding extraordinary strength, subscribe and join us for the next one.